Well, we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to just jump into the evaluation procedures just to get through that, and then hopefully get to the maybe more interesting part, which is a bunch of real-world examples. If you open up your field manuals, you can go straight to the rapid evaluation form or chapter, starting on page 12. Whew. So there's these different levels of evaluation. As a city, you'll generally start with what they describe, colloquially as a windshield evaluation, where they essentially drive through the jurisdiction and just get an overall sense of the scope of damage, and really just a way to inform, high level where things are at and how we want to start thinking about triaging, prioritizing, and deploying resources. Then there's the rapid evaluation, which we'll talk about, detailed evaluation form, and then engineering, which we talked about earlier. So the evaluation steps is kind of similar to before, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time. And you can kind of see some of these checks, even on this first table here on page 13 in chapter 3. But the general procedure is examine exterior of the building, as we discussed, circumnavigate it, look for ground distress. If and only if it's safe to enter the building, you can enter and continue your interior inspection. Discuss observations, go through the criteria. It's really important to have teams of a minimum of 2, partly from a personal safety standpoint, just in case something were to occur, partly because it's helpful to have someone fill out the forms while others taking photos or whatnot, and then partly just having those different perspectives. And so, being able to balance, like, what do you think of that crack? Is that concerning? Why is it? And, just get that spectrum of perspectives, particularly when you have different levels of background expertise. Post the building, inform the occupants of hazards. So the rapid evaluation is really intended for the more obvious buildings, simple, generally 1 to 2 story residential and commercial type buildings. We were walking by a bunch of them on the way here. There's a question at lunch, people are asking about, that seem to be bringing up single family homes. Is that the intent? And I only have been kind of oriented that way for 2 ways. One, when a bunch of volunteer architects and plans examiners have gone to some of these events, non-civil structural engineers, that's often the number of the buildings that get identified to assess, sort of as a volunteer capacity without sort of a explicit engineering background. And then 2, just if you think of the number of buildings within a jurisdiction just from a quantitative standpoint, the single family homes are a large proportion of the overall number of buildings. But all that to say, even though we've kind of been orienting some of the conversations around single family homes, we recognize that particularly in your capacity working for the city, that you'll probably be asked to do to look at buildings, the ones that you work in and occupy on an everyday basis, which means you're probably better qualified than anyone because you know how it's configured, you know the layouts. You can even, if you want, proactively sort of pre-populate some of the information so that it's already prepared. But I imagine if you work in a maintenance building, you might ask to assist with the assessment of maintenance building. If you have a bunch of pump stations, maybe a bunch of single-story CMU buildings, all the spectrum of the building types that the city owns and operates out of. So I don't mean to only sort of orient towards single-family residential construction, because there's a whole plethora, but just things to be aware of. So rapid evaluation, you can recommend a detailed evaluation for questionable buildings. Come on. So the general criteria, you're looking for collapse, partial collapse of the building. Is the building or portion of the building, this is that table on page 13, by the way, or story of the building noticeably leaning. These are not rocket science, yes or no questions. Is there severe racking of walls, obvious severe damage, distress, chimney, parapet, or other falling hazards, severe ground displacement or foundation damage, any other hazard present. So these are sort of the general types of checks, and we'll get to the form in a second. So again, these are fairly straightforward. How do we tell if the building is, or there's racking of walls? What are some good indicators if a building has been moving if I'm walking to a building, try to figure out how much how much movement has occurred. Yeah, crack the window. I was looking for a door to have to go over there to demonstrate a door, but opening doors, windows, they're really good indicators that the building's moving, maybe racking of walls, to use the term on the slide. Make notes for retrieval of personal effects, particularly if this is a residential, but even an office. People sometimes may need to get to their office if it were to be a yellow tech building. So just be cognizant of the accessibility, exits, stairwells, corridors, especially if there's material or debris that have fallen and made those those corridors, access points, not safe. Here's one example of this. This is a loading dock. The building's on piles. The building has basically not been damaged at all, but the access and approach to the loading dock is obviously severely compromised by geotechnical failures, warranting it not that useful. So let's go through the exercise of looking at a building like we've been doing in the morning. What is the building construction type in this one wing of a building that you have no context of? I have to warm you guys up again. We're all operating all cylinders before lunch, and then lunch, Yeah, so it's a reinforced concrete building with a brick facade. You see the brick, and your first instinct is a brick building, but then you can see how it's peeling off, and the nice sort of tidy orientation of the brickwork, and realize it's just a facade. So reinforced concrete shear wall building. Here's some shear walls with coupling beams, spandrel beams. Excuse me. It's pretty hard to tell without any context, either multi office. This happened to be part of a large sort of office development area in the sort of outskirts of Santiago, Chile. How many people would you estimate occupy just the visible wing of this building? 40 to 80, so just kind of real quick ballparking. Okay, there's 4 states offices, so there's 4 by maybe 2 deep, so that's 8 times 5 is 40 offices, so 40 to 80 is a very reasonable, just round ballpark number. You do similar exercise for some of the questions they have on the square footage of the building. You're not expected to do a super detailed estimate, but the building's 50 feet by 30 feet. Okay, we can get a rough ballpark. And then what's the hazard? These bricks are peeling off. Your stereotypical X-cracking that Rami was showing earlier. So there's some damage to the brick facade. It's hard to tell, but it looks like there's some actually pretty good work that this concrete structure's done in these spandrel beams between these windows, specifically in the first and second floors. So some damage to the structural system. Any recommendations for posting? Based on our very rapid assessment that we just did. Yellow, I heard a couple of yellows. And what restriction would you identify, if you were to post it yellow? Entries, if there's a door right over here, which I think there is, or under there, we certainly wouldn't want people to access through those areas with these falling hazards. On the back side of the building, there may be more safe entry points. Otherwise, what about the structural damage? How concerned are you about that? Overall, it's pretty intact. There's a little bit of work. So I think overall, we're pretty comfortable with the condition of the structure. It's just these falling hazards that are concerned. So that would be the type of thing we write up on our rapid evaluation form. What about this? What's the hazard? So it looks like it's a chimney. Given the little bit of context, it's like an unreinforced masonry chimney. So another falling hazard that we'd want to consider accordingly. We keep us moving. So let's get to the form. I think you have a handout of the form. The slides here have a little bit different formatting to make them PowerPointified, but it's all the same content. A rapid evaluation assessment form, so name and address, number of stories, this example is 2. Is there a basement? Yes, no, or unknown. The primary occupancy of the building, they have a number of sample options, residential, commercial, dwelling, getting residents again, school, government, historic, other, the overall rating. So once you kind of go through and make your assessment, you kind of circle back to the top of the form, identify the assessment conclusion, whether it's green, exterior and interior, limit entry, unsafe, ID, affiliation, etc. So here's where that guidance, this is relative to the checklist on the subsequent slide, which is lower on in your ATC 20. So there's 6 main criteria for the rapid form. And so they have instructions, review structure below, a yes to 1, 2, 3, or 5 is grounds for posting the entire structure unsafe. Yes to 4 requires posting the area unsafe. And then hazards such as spills, asbestos release are also covered by number 6 in order to make it unsafe. So let's get to what those checks are in reference to. This is kind of the same thing we were talking about a second ago. Is there collapse, partial collapse, building falls off its foundation? Yes, no, or unknown. Again, these are very, very high level, or more review needed. Severe, or building or store noticeably leaning, severe racking of walls, yes, no, or unknown. Chimney, parapet, other falling hazard. We would have checked yes for that on those previous 2 examples. Ground or slope movement, any other sort of geotechnical concerns, other hazard present. So here they wrote in, there's a severed gas line. So that was a warrant for posting the whole grounds is unsafe. Here is where you have the option to provide recommendations. Any further action is needed if you recommend a detailed evaluation, and if geotechnical, structural, or other sort of level of expertise is recommended. Barricading, like the church example we saw earlier this morning, if barricading is recommended to sort of cordon off a whole area of the site. Here they put a note, building requires major repairs. Was it posted at the assessment, yes or no? Their level of detail of comments, building has moved 2 feet off its foundation, cripple wall failure, severed gas line has been shut off by the local gas company. So that's our rapid form. That's chapter 3 of our field manual. What do you think? After all this talk, that's all it is? Yeah?
So the form you're showing on the PowerPoint is significantly different from the one in our handout. Is that the newer version?
The PowerPoint one is just a PowerPoint-ified. Let me see. So the rapid does, I'm just looking at the physical form here. There are some differences between the slide. A little bit more detail. So the evaluation checks, I think those 6 that we went through,
The checks
are the same. The building description, there is some opportunity to identify the type of construction.
There's no instructions. So someone going through here would say, okay, is a moderate, does that lead to it being unsafe? Like how many moderates do I check? Like,
Yeah, and that's where I'm synthesizing. If you read through your field manual, I think they have a lot of that guidance
yes, I agree.
as well. So like on page 17, for example, they have a little bit of commentary on posting these buildings for the site or the structure unsafe for items 4 and 6, for instance. So there's definitely a lot more expression here that I can certainly reference you to. But I appreciate the comment that a reminder that these ATC 20 standard forms have some additional information that I actually hadn't realized our slide doesn't represent. So it has the name, address, contact, all that stuff. Number of units, that's a little bit different than our slide. Type of construction, it has the opportunity to identify if it's a wood frame, steel frame, under-reinforced masonry, et cetera. Construction type that we've been talking through, talks about the primary occupancy, we did cover that. And then they do have some estimates for building damage excluding contents. the intent for this is not that you're making cost estimates by any means, or even have a real detailed, thorough analysis of what the damage is or what would be required to repair. Primarily the way this is, at least as I understand, is often used is it's really for the jurisdiction to aggregate the total number of amount of damage on a sort of whole or, total level so that they can start basically making requests up the food chain to state and ultimately federal governments once it hits various thresholds. So it's really for FEMA relief documentation purposes, I think, generally speaking. So it's fairly unrelated to what your recommendation is relative to the ATC20 regular green posting. So that's the valuation section. The posting section, it's more or less the same. You can record some additional details on the form that obviously the placard doesn't have space for. And just keep in mind that the form, the intent is this form goes back to the jurisdiction. The placard goes on the building to communicate to the public. So if there's any discretion, I guess you want to apply on what the way that you word stuff to the public versus maybe a little bit more technical detail you might articulate to the jurisdiction. What you populate on the form description of damage versus on the placard, could diverge slightly there. Good question, good comment. Any others?
What's the time frame? The disaster takes place. Do you take a quick run up and down the streets to kind of gauge where to send your inspectors maybe, or are you waiting until all the life and safety is taken care of? I mean, that last one,
Yeah.
the gas company has been there to shut off the gas, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's at the discretion of how the emergency response team, how big of a disaster it is, and how they organize it. One thing to keep in mind is that this type of work is considered second response. So all the first responders that do all the important things they do, firemen, emergency response services, ambulances, all that stuff, that's urban search and rescue in particular for damaged buildings. Those are all first responders. So we are secondary to that, doing ATC20 assessments. So if it is a major disaster where that immediate emergency response efforts are needed, those are likely occurring first before the teams get organized and deployed and mobilized, and then maybe at some point overlapping. And then the other thing is the city is trying to prioritize the essential facilities to get to their hospitals and whatnot first, and then all the buildings. So I think it basically depends, is the unsatisfactory answer in terms of what that duration looks like. But best case is, they're sending teams out the next day. Worst case is it's such a cluster, it's several days before they're even able to think about doing ATC20 assessments because it's just emergency response mode.
Maybe after the critical infrastructure has
Yeah,
been affected.
and it also depends on their capacity and amount of resources coming in. And that's where, even circling back to our discussion of the different types of earthquakes, if we have a local crustal event, say we have a South Whidbey Island event that affects the Everett area, kind of the northern area, down to Seattle some, but it'll attenuate quite a bit, so it's much more severe up here. In terms of regional resources, that's a very different circumstance than if we have a Cascadia event where we have 4 major metropolitan areas from Portland, Tacoma, Seattle, Everett, Vancouver, BC, all demanding resources. That's just a very different ballgame. In terms of what the available resources are, both locally and coming from the outside area to help support in emergency response efforts, as well as this type of second response ATC20 assessments. So I don't know if that really answered, but kind of painting the picture a little bit. Yeah. Was there another one I missed? So that's our rapid form. Our detailed form, again, more careful assessment by generally more qualified team. It requires exterior and interior if you're doing a detailed form, and is important, and I'd say categorically required for essential facilities. So when you're doing your detailed evaluation form, there's a little bit more specificity, got a few extra syllables in there, on the way you think about the structure. But even though that stuff isn't explicitly in the rapid form, I would encourage us, and we go through these, these examples this afternoon, to be sort of thinking through what is the vertical load carrying capacity, the 24/7 gravity demand on this building that's resisting, how much has it been compromised, and what is the lateral load carrying capacity. So as we go through a bunch of these examples, we'll start saying scale 1 to 10, just to turn a qualitative conversation into something that's a little more quantitative. It can be very helpful to help quickly articulate to your colleague, your teammate in the field, your level of concern. So scale 1 to 10, what is the vertical load carrying capacity? 10 being, no earthquake has occurred, there's no damage. 1 being it's on the precipice of collapse. And then scale 1 to 10 was the lateral load carrying capacity of this building after whatever damage occurred. The same other checks, falling hazards, ground displacement, exits and egress, usability, and any other safety concerns. So using this scale 1 to 10, let's talk about this little portion of a building. So what's the building type, structure? Reinforced concrete with a brick facade, excellent. What is the lateral system? What resists earthquake and wind, let's say left to right in the screen? So there's these reinforced concrete shear walls, or these wall piers, and they're also tied together with these spandrel or coupling beams. We have a whole bunch of terms that we use, so just kind of getting some of the vernacular going to circle back on what Rami talked about earlier. So both these wall piers, which carry some gravity load, as well as have lateral resistance, and these coupling beams all together are resisting sideways movement from earthquake or wind. So scale 1 to 10, 10 being perfect, what is the vertical load carrying capacity of this building after experienced 3.5 minutes of shaking from the subduction zone in Chile? I heard pretty consistent 7. I think I might have heard 8 up there. Can I get 9? 9. Oh, 9. I just turned into auctioneer all of a sudden. What about lateral system? Is it more or less than the vertical? Less, because it's these, I'm pointing at the screen like you can see. These coupling beams have done a lot of work. Overall, it's not a 2 though. It's, if it's a 7 to 8, it's a 6 to 7, because these vertical wall piers are still pretty intact. And so overall, what would you rate it then? 1 to 10? 7, 8. So it's done a lot of work. It's absorbed a lot of energy from 3 minutes of cycles of shaking back and forth. But all things considered, it's still pretty intact, even though it's obviously seen some damage from the earthquake, some pretty substantial structural degradation, but it's not like it's about to collapse. So all that to say, that's kind of the thought process as we go through a bunch of examples, holistically of a building, looking at a couple of components. Now juxtaposed to that, here's another reinforced concrete building. There's a parking garage. Scale 1 to 10, what is the vertical load carrying capacity of this? 1 to a 2. Just intuitively, before Rami talked earlier, you might not have talked about brittle versus ductile behavior, but your intuition already knows this is brittle and it doesn't feel right. The way things have cracked open also has this sort of interesting cycling pattern of the damage in the beam versus the middle of the column. Non-ductile concrete construction, so it's 2 to a 3 or 1 to a 2, I think I heard, for vertical and maybe even less so lateral. how concerned are you that an aftershock is going to cause this building to collapse? Very. And so juxtaposed to that, this is so frustrating. This looks pretty darn good. If I hadn't sold you on a 9 before, maybe I can get you sold on a 9 now when you see a 1 to a 2. So this is just kind of giving us a frame of the sort of spectrum of damage. Not all damage, not all structural risk is sort of made equal. What about this? Rami showed this earlier. This is a high-rise building also in Chile, so it went through many cycles. The thing to keep in mind when you look at a building like this is thinking through, kind of like Rami is talking about the strong column, weak beam, or in this case, strong vertical wall pier, weak coupling beam, sort of paradigm. So stuff like this is what we like to see. Piers are pretty intact, here's pretty intact, here's pretty intact, and then your eyes are kind of adjusting, trying to figure out what's going on. That level is very not good. That's not ideal. So, these, that's what we want to see. We want to see that damage concentrated in those coupling beams, not in the wall piers. So I don't have to tell you, obviously very much a high concerning building, but it's also interesting because you can kind of get the spectrum of this is a 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 3, 2, 1, 0. So you can get the whole spectrum of things, thinking about it. So here's our detailed evaluation form. Similar to the rapid form, there's probably some discrepancies between what's in your handout, but there's a building description information, a little bit more detailed number of stories, basement, approximate age and years, the structural system, what's the type, the occupancy, that was also in your rapid form, the overall rating, inspector ID, date, all the sort of administrative stuff. Instructions below, complete building evaluation checklist on the next page and then summarize. So here you have an opportunity to say, was there an original or an existing posting? If so, what was it? And then what's a recommended posting? So say a rapid evaluation is done and you're brought in subsequently to do a second update on the evaluation, or maybe there's a major aftershock. You could say there was originally a green tag and now I'm recommending it red because the conditions changed. Was it posted on the site, yes or no? The original posting, who conducted it, just to document that. Recommendations, the same kind of information, further action, engineering evaluation, structural geotech, other barricades, and here they have a little bit more effusive commentary, but not much. No significant structural damage observed, lots of small cracks in concrete beams and columns, no increased reinforcement exposed, building will require repairs for non-structural damage. So that's the sort of overall summary. And then the checklists are just a little bit more thorough as you go through the structural system and the non-structural system, the overall hazards. So section 1, and it's the same commentary up above, so I won't reread it to you, but structure overall hazards. So that's, is it leaning? Is there a partial or total collapse of a floor or area or portion of the building? Any other sort of kind of global things going on? So really, section 1 is sort of global hazards. Number 2 is structural elements. You have various components, foundations, frames, foundations, columns, diaphragms, moment frames, brace frames. Depending on what's appropriate, you can write in any other components of the structure, and that's where you can say hazardous conditions exist, yes or no, or unknown. Maybe you couldn't see the moment frame. You understand it's a moment frame building, so you could put unknown, wasn't readily accessible, things of that nature. And then they have room for commentary relative to each of those particular checklist items. So, for the moment frames example, they write in 1/32 inch cracking at joints. Not big cracks, but they measured it, identified it, no punching shear, cracks were observed in the flat slab system. So that's our structural checklist.
Square feet or area.
Yeah.
Are you calculating 75,000 square feet for all the office space, or is that the footprint?
I think it's an estimation of the overall square footage. So each floor times 24 floors and quick, back of the envelope math. Really just, again, that's for the aggregated, in those environments, oftentimes the resources are in competition by the municipalities. So just say, hey, we have, 4 million square feet of yellow and red tag buildings, helps make the case that their proportion of resources can get funneled and allocated accordingly. So I think that's generally what that's intended to be used for. Continue on the detailed evaluation criteria, non-structural hazards. So here you can write in parapets, or architectural ornamentation, ceilings, light fixtures, all the stuff inside and outside the building that could potentially be primarily a falling hazard. Yes, no, unknown, and any comments. So they identify damage, not hazardous. Elevators, they say inspected by elevator company. Question. Tell me, what do you think of it? I have Destiny's Child in my head all lunch because of that one comment earlier. My apologies. That's on me. Question, do we inspect elevators as ATC20 assessors, inspectors? I hear some no's. Was there a comment up there? You'd have to be qualified to do it. They're proprietary systems, by definition have lots of moving, complicated parts, and so we definitely don't want to get in the business of evaluating, safety and viability and functionality of elevators. But it does create, for high-rise buildings where that's a necessary component of building accessibility and habitability, it can be a challenge because if we don't know if the elevator is functional, do we want people going in and out of the building?
Well, it's kind of that, but also some buildings, the elevator shafts or they're backbone. If they're damaged, the building itself may not be. They use the elevator shafts as a much stronger unit to help support a lot of the buildings sometimes, right?
Yeah, and oftentimes in those type of buildings, the elevator shafts are the concrete core walls, the reinforced concrete shear walls are sort of the fundamental element of the lateral force resisting system. So they are interrelated, but yeah, so the short answer is we don't inspect elevators, but we should think about and document what we know and don't know. Maybe you press the button and see if it works, and you can say, appears to be operational. That's different than saying, has been assessed, what I mean? Non-structural hazards, geotechnical hazards, any landslides, slope stability issues, liquefaction, lateral spreading, any other things that make the building potentially unsafe from a geotechnical standpoint. And then they have a very simple sketch of the building, ballpark footprint. It's about 60 feet by 120 feet, maybe a laser pointer to verify if you had it on you, low canopy, and that's it. So that's your detailed evaluation form. There also is a fixed equipment form. I don't know if you got that handout, but you can download it from atcouncil.org if you don't have it. Particularly for those of you that know which buildings you already are going to be assigned to conduct assessments of, it wouldn't be a bad idea to sort of pre-populate this with the type of equipment you do have or don't have. And really it just allows you to document, corresponding to a detailed evaluation. Is the equipment damaged, yes or no? And is it operable? So, boilers, chillers, et cetera. Damaged, no or yes, and for the yes, is it yes, there's some damage and operable, some damage and not functional, and attribute commentary to that. So to the previous comment, I think about, relative to non-building assessments, that probably ties in a little bit more directly if you're going to use it for a tank or whatnot. But something to consider if you have a registry of buildings that are already sort of predefined. What can we do to sort of pre-populate those things in advance? And along those lines, detailed evaluation of essential facilities, healthcare, police, EOCs, et cetera, automatically warrant evaluations. One thing I'll mention, there's a number of different things that can be done proactively. You are the jurisdiction, but we'd often advise, someone's busted. I don't really care. Excuse me. We'll advise clients to make pre-arrangements or MOUs, memorandums of understanding with the jurisdiction so that they can have a pre-agreement to do an assessment of their building themselves in advance. So even within the different departments, that type of documentation could be valuable, as sort of just setting up that the PUD can assess their own buildings on behalf of the building department. And this, I know the city of Seattle has a whole mechanism for what they call advisory tagging, so that department can tag their own buildings, but it's an advisory tag, and then subsequently the building department comes in and sort of verifies, corroborates that advisory tag, and it becomes sort of more formalized. So things like that can be done. Having all the reference information on site. If I was asked to do assessment of a building, having the available record drawings is super valuable. There's a couple of programs in the Bay Area. There's basically a way for private building owners to sort of pre-arrange assessment of their buildings called BORP, Building Occupancy Resumption Program. There's also, we've assisted in developing what we've called REAP, which is Rapid Evaluation Assessment Program, which is essentially, the idea is to take the intent and content of ATC20, which is generic for any building, and pre-document all the specific things for a particular building. So we've done that for a number of essential facilities, such as hospitals. I'm not going to go through too much, but there's, the things that we can pre-organize, flow charts, building checklist information, put that in there already. So I guess my encouragement to you all is to think through what could be valuable to help your team expedite an ATC20 assessment. And if you have all of this documentation pre-prepared, even pre-populated to the extent you have the information, that could make your post-earthquake assessments that more expedited, and organize that information, have it be readily available. You can see for these REAP plans that we've developed for various clients, it's all sort of red branded, and the idea is this is to go in a disaster kit, ready to be mobilized and not to get pilfered, as things tend to do, and have them kind of locked up. So I'm not going to go through any of this stuff, even though you see some visuals on what that can look like. But if nothing else, I could share more if you're interested, and to see what we've been doing in customizing ATC20 effectively for buildings. But there's a lot that can be done proactively. And there are even ways to couple it with structural instrumentation. So for hospitals, for instance, we'll put sensors in buildings so it measures in real time how much it moves, and allows the facility managers to compare that with pre-established engineering thresholds to basically make data-based decisions on the habitability and kind of short-circuit ATC20, if you will.